Welcome, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr. Hannah Chapman. I am the Theodore Romanoff Assistant Professor of Russian Studies and an Assistant Professor of International and Area Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. First, I'd like to start out this talk by thanking the Department of International and Area Studies and the Romanoff Center for Russian Studies for sponsoring this event. So on February 24th of 2022, Russia began an unprovoked and unjustifiable attack on the sovereign state of Ukraine. Over the past year, the world has witnessed the remarkable resilience of the Russian people and armed forces amid the huge loss of life, widespread destruction, and the displacement of millions of civilians as the result of Russian aggression. As we enter into the second year of the war, we really have a great opportunity to reflect on the trajectory of the Russian-Ukraine war, where we've been and where we might be going, as well as how it may matter for the rest of the world. So joining us here today to speak on this topic is Dr. Volodymyr Dubovyk. I'm very excited to welcome here today. So Dr. Dubovyk is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and the director of the Center of International Studies at Mechnikov National University in Odesa, Ukraine. His research is on the topic of Ukraine and European security, US-Ukraine relations, and Ukraine's foreign policy. So he is the absolutely perfect person to speak on this topic. Among his very many achievements, which I will not be able to list out today, Dr. Dubovyk is a two-time Fulbright scholar. Actually, we were just talking, he was able to visit Norman on one of his Fulbright trips in the past. And currently, he is a visiting professor at Tufts University. So Dr. Dubovyk is going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will have close to half an hour for Q&A. We will be using the Q&A function for this chat, and I will be moderating the discussion. So if at any point you have questions for Dr. Dubovyk, please just go ahead and put that in the chat in the Q&A function, and I will do my best to answer ask as many questions as possible during our time here. So with that, I will open the floor. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
Hello, thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you everyone in Norman, Oklahoma for being here today for my presentation. It's always an honor to address an audience in yet another American university, and of course, the University of Oklahoma is well known around the country and outside of the US as well. And indeed, I had the pleasure of being a guest for a very short, brief visit actually back in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, where I came from, Austin, Texas, where I was based at the University of Texas and on my Fulbright. So now, of course, today it's really important for us, I think, to speak about this war, definitely for us Ukrainian scholars, to address this issue, because there's a risk always of people not maybe following enough, people not paying enough attention, it kind of may be falling from radar with a lot of people in this country of the United States, that Ukraine still is in the middle of this terrible war, awful war, Russian massive invasion against Ukraine, and it still needs assistance and support for Ukraine and for our country, for our people. And therefore, I need to speak about it, and I need to assess the situation about the war, what's going on the front line, what is happening in general, what probable trajectories or scenarios can be seen going forward, and why this all actually matters for people who are outside of Ukraine or Russia, who are as far away as Americans, 1,000 miles away. So first of all, let me say the war, of course, is very much ongoing. It's proceeding. It's not showing any signs of slowing down or subsiding. On the contrary, actually, I think the last several weeks were probably the most intensive fighting on the front line. And that's a huge front line, by the way. It's about 600 miles. So you can imagine that basically everywhere there is some fighting, some hostility going on. So this war is very much serious and a large scale. I mean, it's dramatically different from the war as it was earlier on between 2014 in 2022 when Russia actually started the war against Ukraine in 2014. So for 8 years, it was more or less mostly the so-called low-intensity conflict, only limited to a bunch of regions, two regions basically in the south, being Crimean Peninsula, and mostly in Donbass, which is in the very east of Ukraine. And of course, it was still a war, a very serious war, a hot war, and 13,000 people were killed in Ukraine during those 8 years between 2014 and 2022. But of course, what started to be happening in Ukraine since February 24th last year is quite different. Because of course it's much different scale, much higher scale of invasion, more Russian troops, more weapons being employed against Ukraine, and massive invasion from various directions, not just one region, but basically a whole bunch of directions where Russians were able to move into Ukraine, not just across the Russia-Ukraine border, but also, unfortunately, across Belarusian-Ukrainian border, because basically Belarus now hardly enjoys any sovereignty, and their president, so-called President Lukashenko, is under complete control in many ways by Mr. Putin, and that's why they're using the territory of Belarus to attack Ukraine. And actually, it's still a possibility that there might be another wave of their offensive coming from Belarus onto the territory of Ukraine. So, of course, you probably heard about the war, a year ago when it started, and how people thought that maybe Russia would completely prevail quickly and overwhelm Ukraine, and Ukraine would just crumble down and would unravel, because there is so much troops that Russia's been employing against Ukraine, and people were looking at the numbers, and they were saying, look, this is an asymmetric conflict. I mean, Ukraine doesn't have a chance. Russia is so much bigger, population-wise. It's at least 3 times bigger than Ukraine, but kind of more maybe than 3 times. It has natural resources. It has a lot of natural resources. It's selling at the international markets. Even now, through the last year, despite the sanctions on Russia, they continue to sell a lot of natural gas, oil, and what have you. So they're getting this profit from those sales, and they can fund the war. So Ukrainian economy, on the contrary, is in ruins, because a smaller country being attacked by Russia. Most of our industrial base is actually in the east and the south. That's where the fighting takes place most of all. So of course, when people looked at the numbers, they said, Ukraine probably would offer some fight, but not enough, and they looked at the naval forces in the Black Sea in the south, and they said Ukraine basically doesn't have a navy. Russia does have a navy. Not only that, that they have navy in the Black Sea, but they also brought some extra ships, battleships, from other fleets in the Baltic and the Northern Sea. So there was complete domination there. In terms of the air force, it was like 10-1, if not more, the domination in numbers by Russians. And of course, everything else, missiles, artillery, tanks, what have you. You pick any particular item in the military forces, and it's domination by Russia by great numbers. So people were looking at the numbers and saying, okay, Ukraine is doomed, and people said that maybe within 2 or 3 days, the capital Kyiv would be taken, and then maybe Ukraine would be completely subjugated by Russia within a couple of weeks or so. But that didn't happen, as you know. And of course, we're really proud of that. It's really something that we have offered them such a resistance. Well, several things happened. First of all, of course, Russian military was probably too arrogant, too self-confident about what they can do. They didn't expect any fight, and they got a real fight on their hands. They were expecting maybe for Ukraine to go down quickly, it didn't happen. So actually, whatever political leadership in Kremlin and Putin himself thought about it, they were also mistaken about Ukrainians' not only willingness, but ability to fight back. And of course, the big thing is that you have a major difference there. You have one army moving into another country with a land grab, with a completely aggressive, offensive, imperialistic war. And a lot of soldiers don't even understand what they're doing there in Ukraine, why they're in Ukraine. And on the other hand, you have the military force, which consists of people who are really aware what they're doing. They're defending their homeland, and not in any abstract terms, but actually in the terms of defending their own towns and cities and regions and families and their children and so on. So in terms of motivation, there was a huge gap there. There's a huge disparity between Russian troops and Ukrainian troops, and that's helping, of course, Ukrainians to fight back. And for a number of years, we've been talking about the increasing resilience of Ukrainian people, and I was frankly wondering, what does it even mean, this word resilience? But now I know, for the last year plus, No, that's really the ability for the entire country, entire society to fight back, to be resilient, to be staying put, to be alive, to be surviving, to be fighting back. And people actually wondered, like, does Ukraine have it or not? Frankly, there was a big discussion between, say, August of 21 and February of 22. Would Ukraine become another Afghanistan? You might remember when American troops decided to leave, and then President Biden made a decision about withdrawing American troops, and talibs quickly took over. Afghanistan just unraveled completely. Their government, the military forces. So people were wondering, like, would Ukraine behave the same way when they're faced with overwhelming force of Russian military? But that didn't happen. I mean, of course, in Afghanistan, for instance, President Ashraf Ghani just jumped on a plane and left the country in panic. In Ukraine, President Zelensky said, "No, I'm not going anywhere," because actually he was offered to do that because Russian troops and tanks were coming closer to capital of Kiev, and there were special teams there in the area who were actually told to take him out. But he said, "No, I'm staying." So he stayed, and the government stayed, and so on. And the entire country actually been very resilient in terms of like not really giving an inch. Of course, some people did leave their hometowns, specifically women and children. If you have little children, you're trying to go away from the places where you have bombs and shelling and everything. So that's understandable. That's why we had millions of refugees of Ukrainians in Europe, but also some more millions of Ukrainians being so-called internally displaced people, meaning they had to leave their home and go somewhere else in Ukraine when there's not much fighting, when there's kind of safer, further away from front line, but other people just contributed. Even those I've just mentioned, they're contributing. I mean, they're contributing with sending money back home and so on. There is a lot of crowdfunding in Ukraine, and it's not a rich country, obviously, even now, or even more so, even poorer because of Russian destruction in Ukraine. But people have been able to buy with their own money, Ukrainians themselves, to buy, satellites and radars and other things that needed for the military. But of course, I'll come to that, but it's very important to understand that a lot of assistance is coming to Ukraine from outside of the country. That assistance encompasses military weapons, but also humanitarian assistance and so on. But going back to the war, Ukrainian military been able to actually push back some of the Russian troops earlier on in the north near capital Kiev, another region of Chernihiv. Later on, in the region near the city of Kharkiv, there was a major offensive by Ukrainian troops, which liberated a big slot of land from Russian occupiers. And then, of course, closer to the end of the year, we took the biggest city in the south, one of the biggest cities in the south, the biggest the Russians ever took from us, called Kherson. So a lot of people now expect that Ukrainian troops might be able actually to continue with liberating Ukrainian lands. And here we stand, where we stand right now, because Russians, of course, are trying to continue the war, and we are thinking that we can probably push them back further down the road. And what Russia's been doing, of course, unfortunately for us and for everyone else who's involved in helping Ukraine, is they're not considering quitting. They're not admitting they made mistakes. They're not necessarily admitting they have some failures in Ukraine. On the contrary, they're doubling down. They're basically saying, okay, we're going to fight some more time. Ukraine will unravel one day. We just have to wait. Or maybe the Western coalition of countries supporting Ukraine would unravel one day, and then when Ukrainians are left without financial assistance and weapons coming from the West, we would just prevail. That seems to be the kind of thinking that is dominating now in the Kremlin. Putin definitely thinks that way. How much he actually has of power to go forward, that's an open question, because we don't know everything about the state of Russian economy and Russian military forces. Right now, they seem to be overwhelmed. Some really big problems with getting more troops. They're running out of ammunition. Most reports, military experts say that they don't have enough ammunition anymore to continue large-scale warfare. They're still trying to go on offensive in Donbass region in the east of Ukraine, but they are really limited and restrained to this one little, slot of land really there. They're trying to take the city of Bakhmut, for instance, for many, many months now, and they couldn't. Ukrainians are defending Bakhmut, and actually Ukrainian troops are losing a lot of our own guys, but Russians are still losing more. Some people say sometimes like 1 to 5, but therefore, Ukrainians are deciding so far to continue to defend the city of Bakhmut because what you do is you put the Russian troops through the meat grinder. If you have this correlation of losses 1 to 5, if it's really true, and some people say it's even probably more, if you Ukraine, you're kind of thinking, okay, I mean, we're losing our guys. It's terrible. It's awful, but it's a big war in terms of winning the war, having a chance of winning the war. The enemy is losing even much more. So there is a discussion about whether the war is going to own goal. What Russians actually did their mobilization later last year. Putin announced the partial mobilization. They mobilized something like 200,000 to 300,000 people. Formally, they say 300,000 people. Some experts were initially dismissive of that mobilization, saying that we're talking about people who don't have much experience, most of them not really motivated, some of them are ill-equipped because Russia's running out of some ammunition, and many are not well trained. So normally you would train them for a week and then bring them to the front line. So of course people cannot have proper abilities and skills to fight the war after such a short, brief training. But that's probably true, and that's why Russia is stalled there in Donbass and couldn't really move forward within Ukraine. But at the same time, it's a lot of new people, new fresh meat, as they say, because Putin, of course, doesn't care at all about how many soldiers he loses in the war. Unfortunately, he's doubling down. The importance of Ukraine is too high for him. He's been actually saying for a long period of time there is no such thing as Ukraine. There's no such people as Ukrainians. So we should probably take some of those lands, the historical Russian lands. That's what he's saying out loud for a number of years, and a lot of people were trying to figure out what he means by saying that, why he's saying that. And now we understand kind of that he probably means what he's saying, and he believes in that himself. So that's why, of course, for him to lose the war, to not overwhelm Ukraine, to just quit and withdraw maybe from Ukraine would be unthinkable. It would be such a humiliation and embarrassment for him that he couldn't take. Of course, he's very proud. He's also been a very rational player for a number of years. He was known for actually thinking through several steps ahead, maybe doing tactical steps and then recessing and then doing more steps. But now he's been really unhinged ever since February last year. A lot of people say he lost his rationality. Others say that no, actually he's still rational, just a different kind of calculus now that he has a different kind of rationale. So anyhow, Ukrainians are still hoping to continue to liberate our land. And of course, we're receiving some of the weapons, sometimes a little late than we would rather have them to be receiving. There is a twofold sentiment, really a mood in Ukraine about the weapons coming to Ukraine. One is that people are really grateful for everyone who is assisting, but another one is frankly that people say, well, why is there such delay? Why they're telling us that we're going to receive some weapons tomorrow when we needed them yesterday. And of course, the price of that delay is many, many more lives of Ukrainian military being lost. But now there is, of course, a lot of things on their way. I mean, there's a lot of new artillery. There's a lot of armored carriers coming in, Americans, Bradley, Strykers, and others. There are some tanks coming in, slower than we would want them to be coming to Ukraine. Decision has been made as late as start of this year that the tanks will be supplied to Ukraine. And first of all, the German-produced Leopard tanks, but also American tanks called Abrams are coming to Ukraine, but not anytime soon, because Abrams will only take some time for them to be delivered and be ready to be delivered. And also Ukrainian crews, of course, have to spend some time on learning how to use them. But actually in the previous months, in the last year, Ukrainian military has been showing wonders of how quickly they were able to learn how to use Western weaponry, and actually how creatively they've been applying it. There have been already a number of publications here and there and reports by American military how they're learning now from how Ukrainians use their own weapons on the battleground against Russian troops and enrich themselves with understanding, oh my God, you can actually do this with those weapons. And I never thought of that. So a lot of things like that. And so therefore, we're kind of hopeful. But of course, we need to be mindful of the case of the situation that Ukrainian military is also, limited to numbers. They're not immortals. They're not invincible. They're just people, humans from flesh and blood, So we're losing some of those guys. Some of the best soldiers were already lost throughout this year. Of course, we don't have money to fund the war ourselves. And finally, those weapons, when would they arrive to Ukraine or not? There is now talk about maybe military jets coming in, like F-16s. There's discussion about that. There have been rumors that apparently some Ukrainian pilots have already been training on F-16s just in case if there is a political decision that the Ukraine will be provided those. Little before the New Year, the Christmas Day, there was this decision announced that Ukraine was going to receive the anti-aircraft air defense system called Patriot, also from US. Ukrainians have been learning to use it, and hopefully and apparently they soon will be able to use those Patriot batteries, because we need them, because Russia is attacking us from the sky, not with Air Force, because actually we've been very successful in downing their airplanes, but with missiles of all sorts, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and also drones, aerial drones. Just last night, actually one of the worst attacks on Ukraine with those missiles and drones took place in Ukraine. There were 81 missiles sent into various targets into Ukraine. About half of them been downed by Ukrainian air defense, but that's not a very high number. Usually, actually, the numbers, the percentage of weapons, of missiles being downed by Ukrainian air defense is even higher. This time it's just about half, so it's not enough. Some missiles actually, luckily enough, didn't meet their targets, but others did. And of course, Russians are using more and more expensive missiles, like Kinjal and Kalibr and others, and they cost them a lot, but right now they don't care. They just want to overwhelm Ukraine and break our patience and our resilience. That's what they're doing. And someone calculated that the last night probably cost Russia something like $600 to $700 million just in the wars of the price of weapons being used on Ukraine last night, those missiles. But they're also trying to, of course, to create some kind of a social unrest in Ukraine. Apparently, they've been doing this for a number of months now. They're trying to destroy power stations, energy infrastructure in Ukraine. So throughout the winter in Ukraine, a lot of people were without power, which means without water supply, which means without electricity, without heating, without internet and everything. So apparently, they thought that maybe Ukrainians would suffer too much and struggle with this period of time, and people would come to the streets and demand for President Zelensky to sign some kind of peace treaty with Russia. But of course, little they know about Ukrainians and what motivates us, what drives us. They actually miscalculated, because on the contrary, it even increased the anger among Ukrainians about what Russians are doing. The consolidation within Ukrainian society is enormous. Yes, there were people in Ukraine who were kind of pro-Russian, maybe had some sympathies towards Russia before the war, but now their number is basically getting closer to zero, because you can't like the country which is doing this to you. And also, moreover, I mean, there's most of the destruction and most of the fighting is actually taking place in the east and the south of Ukraine, where that's exactly where you had most of those ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. So now they're suffering, now they're dying, now they have to escape their hometowns. And therefore, as a result of this, I think Russia is really losing any kind of social base within Ukraine of people who were pro-Russian. So right now, there's basically no pro-Russian political force in Ukraine. The major opposition party, which was pro-Russian, they basically dismissed themselves on the local level, on the regional level, and so on. Some of them actually moved to Russia. So that's what's happening now in Ukraine on the ground. But of course, there is a large coalition of countries supporting Ukraine. Just for instance, Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which meets about once a month, more or less, and it includes more than 50 countries that are supplying Ukraine with some military assistance. Of course, some give more, some give much less, but still, many countries around the world actually giving some assistance to Ukraine. Now, what can happen in the coming months? I mean, of course, Russia can try and overwhelm Ukraine's defenses. So far, it's not working for them. They can probably announce another round of mobilization. They can do that, theoretically speaking, but also people wonder maybe at some point of time, the patience of Russian people with Putin would be broken, because how many more lives do you want to spend in this senseless war? Because, Ukraine didn't attack Russia. Ukraine didn't present any threat to Russia. Only to Putin, maybe being a democratic country next door to his authoritarian system, only in that respect, only in that sense. But if they do another round of mobilization, maybe finally Russians will say, well, that's enough, too many people are dying. We'll see. But for right now, of course, they're kind of desperate in many ways. In Ukraine, of course, people are hopeful that military would be able to liberate our occupied lands. We've seen what Russians do in those occupied lands on a number of occasions. Unfortunately, we've seen too many war crimes, massive war crimes, massive rapes, children, I mean, basically many children stolen from Ukraine, from their parents, brought to Russia for forceful adoption by parents in Russia, where they have their parents alive back in Ukraine. So, I mean, just one example. I mean, it's really a war of, many people say, a genocidal war. Many people say war of annihilation. And there are actually signs of genocidal war. A lot of experts here in this field in the West are actually saying that they're seeing a lot of signs of this being a genocidal war. It's actually a war on everything Ukrainian, because it's also a war about Ukrainian culture. They're destroying with their missiles Ukrainian libraries, museums, educational institutions. They are taking out of Ukrainian libraries and occupied lands all of the Ukrainian language books and burn them. They fire or persecute in other ways Ukrainian teachers in the schools, and actually bring teachers from Russia so they can conduct lessons for the children in occupied lands and brainwash them and tell them it's Russian now, it's not Ukrainian anymore. So it's really a major war there, and that's what we're having right now. And why is that something that should be of any interest to anyone outside of Ukraine? Because some people might say, well, it's far away from us. We don't understand this Russian-Ukrainian relationship. They have probably troubles for centuries, so why should we care? Well, people should care for many reasons. Well, first of all, there are many implications of this war, ongoing war already. In the post-Soviet space, where other former Soviet republics are, there are many implications. Like, for instance, the Belarus, I mentioned it already. If Russia prevails in this war, there's basically no Belarus going forward. There is no sovereign independent country. Belarus is going to be province of Russia. If Russia fails in that war against Ukraine, Belarus actually has a chance to get rid of this maniacal dictator called Lukashenko and actually come up with a new government and free and fair election and being a democratic republic. There's a small country of Moldova next door, actually, to my hometown of Odesa, which is also under threat. Actually, in the last few days and weeks, Russia is trying to destabilize Moldova. They're organizing some demonstrations and provocations against the pro-Western, pro-European government there and the president Maya Sandu. So they're trying to destabilize it. In other countries, you probably heard about protests in the last few days in the Georgia country in the South Caucasus, where the public is vehemently in support of Ukraine, but the government is actually very, very cautious and in many ways actually following the Russian command. So there is a major gap there, and therefore there is now protests within that country. And many other countries there. I mean, there is Central Asia, for instance, a bunch of countries there, South Asia, Central Asia, where usually Russia was very strong, and many of those states were Russian clients in many ways, but now they're actually much more emboldened. They talk back to Putin, and actually there was a meeting last year. In the video you can see how they're actually raising their voice, talking to Putin, something unthinkable before. Why is that the case? Because Russia is not invincible anymore. They see the limits of Russian power. They see Russia being weakened militarily. So whenever now someone is threatening, Russia is threatening some other countries in the region, people say, well, I don't know, maybe it's a hollow threat because they kind of have all their troops now in Ukraine and failing. So what do they can actually do to us, since they're actually using all their troops to overwhelm Ukraine? But people are worried still, of course. I mean, of course, if Russia prevails in this war, there's going to be a dramatic escalation of the threat level for them. Everyone on the eastern flank of NATO, they're going to be really thinking we're next. And that's what they're thinking. And that's one of the reasons why they're helping Ukraine so much. The most enthusiastic support for Ukraine is actually in those countries, on the eastern flank of NATO, on Eastern Europe, the Baltics, for instance, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, those countries are actually supporting Ukraine the most, but then Poland, of course, many other countries in the region. And frankly, they have reason to be worried. Like, of course, Russia can be actually emboldened. If they overwhelm Ukraine, in a few years, maybe they would have more forces and ready for more aggression. I think the Russian threat is now a threat to not just Ukraine, but to the entire region and entire Europe, if you like, the entire Atlantic space. And that needs to be understood that, if they attack tomorrow one of the countries in the Baltics, for instance, I mentioned, and they're all EU members and NATO members. So if NATO members attack, then the US has to fight, actually send soldiers to fight and die for that particular country because of the alliance obligations under alliance rules. under Washington Treaty, under so-called Article Chapter 5 in the founding treaty of NATO, Washington Treaty from 1949, which says that there should be collective defense. So basically, if one country is attacked, it means entire alliance is attacked. So that's one thing. Another thing, of course, what would Russia victory mean for the international order, for things like sovereignty, territorial integrity, just for the justice in international affairs, if you like? The world would be turned into a jungle. No more rules, no more order, no more something like that, the conduct of honor or something like that. No, you have the force, you have the stronger predator in the region, you use your force in your neighbor, you grab some lands from your neighbor, that's it, no one stops you. If Russia gets away with it, it's going to be a very meaningful and powerful message to the future Russia, first of all, but second of all, also to many other countries around the globe, which are watching really carefully, and they probably might think, okay, if Russia did it, why don't we try to do it with some of our neighbors? For the United States, of course, the domination of Russia in post-Soviet Eurasian space would be a really bad idea. Russian domination in the Black Sea region, bad idea. Russia prevailing and getting ready to maybe move into Eastern Europe, really serious menace. Russia putting key European allies of the United States under threat, a major challenge. So, and we can go on with this list. So for this country, the United States, support of Ukraine is motivated, is driven not just by values, but also by interests. With values, it's easy. And that's what most of the time President Biden refers to when he speaks about this war and American support for Ukraine. Why is it needed? Well, first of all, you see the outrage, with people seeing what's happening on TV. Innocent country attacked, people fleeing, refugees, children suffering, children being killed, the war crimes and everything. So just in terms of values and principles, what you believe in, what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, it's kind of black and white, really, who do you have to support? But in terms of interests, I just gave you a bunch of interests, which would really push US to support Ukraine against Russian invasion. But can there be enough of that support? We don't know. The war is still raging. And of course, there are some people in this country, United States, who are already saying that, maybe it's not in our business to support Ukraine anymore. Maybe we're spending too much money. It's tens of billions of dollars. We have issues to deal with domestically here in Ukraine, here in US. We have other problems where we have to solve all the problems internationally. Ukraine is a corrupt country, and indeed that's true. We have some corruption in our countries, but so the logic for some of them is like, why are we supporting the corrupt country? So there are many reasons and arguments being used, but frankly, I think America should understand that they can still play a major role internationally, globally, as a force for good, as someone who is supporting the good guys. The day when America stops supporting the good guys would be a bad day in American history. And so far, we are seeing a lot of American leadership, frankly, and we haven't seen any of that since on such a scale in the last several decades, ever since the time of the old Cold War times. But now you're seeing it, and people were kind of wondering: is America strong enough to actually lead this effort? Is American leadership possible in today's world? Is American leadership needed? And now we have answers to all those questions. America is still very strong. They can do things, especially when working with allies and through allies. And that's a big coalition that the United States put together to support Ukraine and punish Russia. And also, American leadership not only is needed, because without it, it will be much more problematic to even imagine such a massive, systemic, well-coordinated, coherent response to Russian aggression. But it's also very much needed, but also very much possible. That's what Americans are doing. And actually, this administration, Biden administration, started doing it even prior to February 24th last year, because the Russian troops started to gather on Ukrainian borders in late October of 2022, or rather 2021 even, of course, the year before last year. And Americans saw that, and they thought that maybe it's a preparation for this massive invasion. And that's why they put the plan in the war, like if Russia indeed invades Ukraine massively as it did, what's going to happen to Russia, like sanctions, what's going to happen to Ukraine, what kind of support, how the weapons will be provided, even like put it on the map, show us the route, how the weapons would actually be delivered to Ukraine. So when February 24th last year happened, everyone was ready to go from day one, from moment one, actually. Yeah, they didn't have to start from scratch. Imagine the only beginning talks about sanctions on Russia or how you support Ukraine on a day when the invasion starts, you're going to spend weeks and months maybe talking about it without maybe getting to consensus very too much soon. But luckily enough, as I said, this administration actually thought it through, where some mistakes may be made, maybe. One thing that often prevails quicker, more expedient assistance to Ukraine is fears of escalation on Russia's part. A lot of times, this administration been thinking like, oh, we probably shouldn't give it to Ukraine because Russia must escalate. And a lot of red lines. Actually, a lot of weapons we now receive from this country, the United States, is where a year ago considered completely not possible to give to Ukraine because Russia would be just annoyed, irritated, and they will escalate. But now the red lines shifted many times. We're getting all those weapons, including Patriots and tanks and maybe some more things. And before that, HIMARS, which is multiple launch rocket systems that actually made a big difference in this war for Ukraine when they were provided to Ukraine. And, so that there is maybe less fear of escalation right now because, for instance, people think that probably Russia cannot escalate anymore. They're already using most of their conventional weapons on Ukraine. What they can do, of course, theoretically, as possible, they can use weapons of mass destruction. So it's not just nuclear, but actually biological, maybe chemical, and so on. But most experts now think this is not entirely impossible, but probably not gonna do it for a number of reasons. First of all, if Putin uses some tactical nukes on Ukrainian troops, it's not going to give him a win right away. Ukraine is still not going to surrender, capitulate. Our troops will still be pushing against their troops. So on the battleground, it's not going to give him any clear advantage when the moment comes, God forbid, he uses those weapons. Second of all, he will be really ostracized even more so than now. And a lot of countries that are kind of sympathetic to Russia, maybe neutral or sitting on the fence, they would be saying, oh my God, Russia's doing this, using nuclear weapons, we cannot support them anymore. So they'll be really turned into pariah state. And finally, there's been a plan apparently put together by NATO countries, including US, that if Russia does it to Ukraine, use nukes against Ukrainian troops or Ukrainian civilian infrastructure or any Ukrainian cities, again, God forbid, then there will be probably conventional strike, not with nuclear weapons, but with usual conventional weapons by NATO against Russian troops in Ukraine. And they can do it, and they can really obliterate Russian troops in Ukraine quickly because they have the right arms. So God forbid we get there, because there will be a major escalation of this war. And of course, it might actually quickly have a spillover effect and internationalize, and other countries will join. So I hope we don't get there. But the message should be understood by Putin that he could not get away with it. But so therefore, most people now think that probably the nuclear escalation is not going to happen, even though no one, of course, is sure 100%. Because like I said, Putin is often seen by some experts as losing some of his rationality, as being unhinged, if he's been cornered, if he is facing this humiliating defeat, he's not seeing the exit ramp for himself, then he actually might do some completely insane things. It's still possible. And he's unfortunately still in control. I mean, if someone expected maybe Russian massive protests, or maybe Russian business elite doing something against him, or maybe his own generals doing some kind of coup, understanding that this war is a massive loss of life for a Russian military in Ukraine, and they couldn't prevail, maybe they would do something. But no, unfortunately, he's still firmly in control. That's the logic of authoritarian society, the system in Russia, and actually maybe drifting towards totalitarian, frankly, because now if you say publicly, if you write something on Facebook that I don't think this war is the right thing, you're brought to court, you're given several years in the jail. So that's not really authoritarian anymore. It's kind of bordering now on totalitarian society as we know it. So unfortunately, that's what's going on with this war, and there are many players outside who are still maybe calibrating what they should do. One of those major players is China. We're talking about China quite a lot in the last few days. In the first year of the war, China was kind of neutral. Well, first of all, it's actually a strategic partner for Russia, and they have a strategic partnership agreement signed shortly before Russian massive invasion into Ukraine. But the Chinese propaganda actually aligns completely with Russian propaganda. They say this war is completely the fault of the West, of NATO, of EU, of US, and so on, and Ukraine. So basically, Russia is defending itself. That's on propaganda side. There is clearly this alignment between China and Russia. But in many other respects, China has been very careful not to give too much assistance to Russia, and being not helpful, maybe not very hopeful, or rather happy with this war, because it destabilizes international markets. It's bad for Chinese economy, which is slowing down anyway. China is too closely associated with Russia, and Russia is doing this war crimes in Ukraine, so it's kind of bad for their reputation. Chinese work diligently with Europe on trade deals and everything, and now Europe is turning anti-Chinese because of their position in this war. So maybe they are, as American intelligence is now saying, and American public officials, including Secretary Blinken, saying publicly that China is contemplating providing some weapons to Russia. Maybe they are. That would be really in violation of many arguments that experts put together why China should continue to stay out of this war, maybe, even though being formally an ally with Russia. But we'll see. If China really provides a lot of weapons to Russia, that would be unfortunate, of course, for Ukraine. They provide a little bit of weapons, maybe not that problematic, not going to change the course of the war. That's what is emerging to me as maybe one of their options. Maybe give Russia a little bit of that military assistance and tell them, okay, we helped you, so we're not completely neutral. But on the other hand, avoid condemnation, international condemnation, and sanctions, because of course, China would be immediately a target of sanctions if they started doing this. So there are many things happening around the world as an implication of this war, and that's why I think it's very important for people to understand it's not just about Ukraine and Russia. It's really about the entire international community, and that's why I thought I would spend some time on talking about this. And I've been talking for about 40 minutes or so, and I'll be happy to, I can see there are many people following me there. I can see the number of participants, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those initial remarks. I think there's a lot of different things that we could talk about, and we've already got quite a large collection of questions.
Okay.
So I think what I'll probably try to do here is I'll try to combine questions on the same theme and ask you to talk more broadly around them so we can get to as many as possible. So you've mentioned this a little bit already, but I would like to hear your thoughts a little bit more. So there's been a lot of debate among experts and people watching this conflict about who has the advantage at this point in the conflict. So on one side, the argument goes that Russia arguably still has more resources, even with the sanctions and even with the depletion that we've seen over the past year, as well as a larger population to draw support from. On the other hand, Ukraine has the backing of a very strong international coalition, while Russia, as you mentioned, has fewer allies, particularly those that are willing to support them, and a very high casualty rate as well. So could you speak a little bit about your thoughts on this debate and what that might mean for the future trajectory of the conflict?
Excellent question, of course, and I should say that on the paper, on the first glance, gives us an impression that Russia has an upper hand. It's always been an asymmetric conflict, as we say it in our field, because Russia, as you said, is bigger. Just look at the map. They have this natural resources. They have this human resources. They're selling a lot of them internationally, getting the money that they can use to fund the war. But on the other hand, the number of people they can actually use to fight the war is still limited. The people who are experienced enough, who have knowledge, maybe previous military training, is very limited. For instance, it's got as bad for them as one of the guys with a private military company called Wagner, Mr. Prigozhin. He's actually done a tour of releasing people from jails, Russian prisons, so they can fight in the war. You can say it's a pretty desperate act, and they died in massive numbers. A lot of them already died or been captured or been injured, because of course it's not professional military. You just basically have a bunch of people who are cons, and they're released and then been told, if you happen to be alive, and if you just survive this meat grinder, you will be a free person. So they go and fight in Ukraine and die in massive numbers. So yeah, it's not necessarily great. I mean, for Russia, if they're running out of ammunition, and there are signs that they are, it's also not too good. And they haven't been planning for this massive war. That's another thing. I mentioned that before, but I would probably, emphasize on this again, that they've been thinking they're going to be there within days in Kyiv and a couple of weeks of fighting. There was no plan B whatsoever, and then they were kind of shocked for many months and trying to figure out what we do next. What is our plan B, because we don't have one. So, and now they're struggling to a large extent. Yeah, and they're struggling, and that's what's going on. So if they can't renew their military production cycle because of sanctions, they'll be out of weapons. They're looking around, not too many are willing to give them. Maybe North Korea, there is of course cooperation with Iran, but that wouldn't be enough. for such a massive war they're waging on Ukraine, that would be not enough. These two countries I mentioned, their assistance. If China weighs in, that's going to be more problematic for Ukraine, of course, but I still hopeful they wouldn't. And that in that respect, of course, it's on the one hand, it's kind of an advantage for Russia, of course, as I said, it's asymmetric conflict. On the other hand, and the war is happening in Ukraine. It's Ukrainian economy destroyed, Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian power stations and factories and plants and so on, industrial base, but not Russian. All right. So in that respect, of course, it's kind of an advantage for them. But as you mentioned, Ukraine is being supported. The only thing that Ukraine is being supported, but not with troops. Right. That's another thing. Of course, everyone doesn't want to have a direct confrontation with Russia. That's been clear to us from day one. I mean, to us experts in the field in Ukraine, we thought, no one, that's an absolute priority and imperative for NATO, for US and other countries in the region, not to get into direct confrontation with Russia. So you can help Ukraine, whatever you can do, whatever you can, but not sending troops, obviously, to fight with Ukrainians against Russians. So this kind of assistance is limited. And now there is a question of how long that kind of assistance can be maintained and how long it can stay together. Would there be actually more voices in US and in Europe? There are plenty of those who are saying, no, that's enough. I mean, we need to stop this war. Let's talk some sense into Ukrainians actually controlling most of their territory. They can do without all those occupied by Russian lands. Let's push Ukraine and Kyiv, the capital, towards some kind of peace agreement. Let them have some kind of a peace deal with Russia. We're spending too much money. There is inflation in our countries. There is a public disconcert about this and some unrest and so on. So Putin is really betting on this, that at one point of time, maybe there'll be changes, maybe some forces in the House of Congress here in the US would eventually block further assistance to Ukraine. The latest, the hopes for him would be maybe in 2024 as it comes to this country with other countries. So they also have their own, estimates, and maybe some expectations. So, but for now, of course, this coalition actually is shown quite a tremendous staying power. Some people said it wouldn't last a year. It did last a year. Moreover, in the last couple of months, January, February, we've seen a lot of doubling down by Western coalition helping Ukraine. And I keep saying Western, it's not just Europe and North America. It's actually a bunch of countries in Asia Pacific, for instance, like Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So there are actually other countries helping Ukraine too. It's basically, a lot of them is seen also through the prism of democracy versus the authoritarian system. Ukraine is democracy, maybe imperfect, but it's a democracy. We have rotation of power, we have civil society, we have free and fair elections and so on. Russia is something very different. So when you're choosing through the prism of what you believe in, what your society is based on, what kind of principles and values, you kind of tend to choose Ukraine. Yeah, that's our guy. That's our guy. It's a good guy. That's fine. So that's what's going on. So if we can think that this support will be maintained as we go forward, then Ukraine has this tremendous advantage. So basically, both sides have their own advantages and disadvantages. And it's really hard right now to say what's going to happen. And every time I can tell you, every time I read something or I hear someone saying, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen, that's a moment I stop reading and stop listening. And so should you, because no one knows. And there's so many variables and so many unknowns going forward. It can turn in so many ways. We just don't know who's going to prevail. Right now, of course, it's two very gritty and stubborn nations fighting. Russians have their staying power, and Ukraine is also very known for being able to fight their ground and stand their ground.
So I think your comment that, we really don't know how the conflict is going to end is a very, and is a correct one. I'm always hesitant to try to predict too far into the future, particularly in a conflict as the one we're seeing now. But that is, of course, one of the main questions that I'm seeing here that I think everybody had. So maybe I can reframe where we might be going from here.
Right.
Maybe in terms of what might a hypothetical peace look like?
Yeah.
To succeed in liberating its territory, or on the other hand, what would failure or loss look like for Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, first of all, of course, it's very hard sometimes to agree even on definition of basic terms like win, victory, or loss and defeat. Like, what do you mean exactly? Like, for instance, for Ukraine, some people say, and I tend to agree, that the fact that Ukraine exists still now after a year of massive Russian invasion as independent state, a sovereign state still standing proudly, controlling 83% of their territory without Russia having any immediate chance to, to expand their land grab within Ukraine. That's already a victory of a sort, right? But then, of course, you begin to think like, okay, we need to liberate the lands that are currently occupied by Russia. Can we liberate all of them? Within what time frame? At what expense? Are we going to continue to lose a lot of Ukrainian military to do that? Can we actually even do that, even with the best Western weapons? Maybe we cannot, because Russia actually also drew some lessons from their mistakes, and they're now fighting better. And of course, they are heavily entrenched now defensively in Ukrainian territory, expecting Ukrainian offensive. And it's very hard to be an offensive. Usually you lose more people when you're trying to do an offensive. That's what Ukrainian military has to do in the coming months. But still, I think we should try, and we'll see if those Western weapons are actually handy. A lot of Ukrainian troops are actually been trained in recent months outside of Ukraine on the new weapons. And if they're put into this battle with these new weapons, maybe we would be able to turn the tables and actually, break through the lines of defense of Russians, and maybe cut their lines of defenses to several places. And we'll see. Maybe they want to unravel, like it happened in Kharkiv region several months ago, when they suddenly didn't expect this Russian-Ukrainian offensive, and they completely unraveled. That front line was just, they were retreating in panic. If that can happen in the coming months, hopefully, for Ukraine, we'll see. But then if we can't prevail, if we continue losing a lot of our people, if even with all these weapons coming from the West, we cannot really liberate all of our occupied lands, then we'll reassess in the coming months, maybe by the end of spring, maybe more probably by the end of summer, because we'll see like, okay, we're not prevailing, okay, or prevailing, or something like that. So there'll be actually a moment of reckoning in some respect, when Ukrainians as a country, as a nation, as a people, and the government of Ukraine would have a moment to assess, like, what can we do, and how we proceed forward. And right now, of course, the government and the people are united in saying that, of course, we should liberate all of our lands, because, of course, who can in the right mind say otherwise? Because we see what Russians are doing in occupied lands. So, of course, the Ukrainians say we cannot condemn and doom these millions of people, Ukrainians, to be living under Russian occupation. We have to do whatever is in our power and more, to liberate them. But can we actually do that? I hope so. We're a nation of hope right now. But in the coming months, we'll actually give a more definite answer.
So one of the things you mentioned a number of times is that many observers expected this war, and the Russian government itself expected this war to end quickly.
Yeah.
We are here after the 1 year invasion, 1 year anniversary of the invasion. Why do you think so many people underestimated Ukraine's ability to resist invasion?
Right. Well, first of all, the power, the magic of numbers. I mentioned that. If you see one country which is much bigger, which military force is bigger, and they actually spent apparently on modernizing their army lots of money over years. So, and then you see a smaller country, and you see, well, it's really hopeless. It's really different leagues, different weight categories. Frankly, in this boxing match, one can easily predict who's going to win, and quickly by knockout. All right. So if we continue to use this parallel with boxing, but yeah, but that's one thing. Other thing, of course, not really understanding how much resilience and how gritty Ukrainians are, we value the freedom, personal freedom for our country, sovereignty. And not understanding how much has the Ukrainian military been changed over years too. Being trained much better, including being trained by Americans and Brits and Canadians and others, military instructors in Ukraine, who actually taught Ukrainians to fight better in a smaller, tactical, creative way, because the Russians have been doing this obsolete warfare, waiting for some general at the very top to give them a command what to do next. Ukrainians are at the same time are making a lot of decisions on the ground and attacking Russians and so on. That's been an extremely valuable moment, and this kind of a gap that I just described in the way you fight the war in the first weeks and months of the war. That's why Russian tank column, many dozens of miles outside of Kiev, they had tanks and everything, but they got stuck, didn't know what to do. And in the meantime, Ukrainians attacked them and so on. So I guess there are many reasons there. And also their assistance coming to Ukraine was underestimated by a lot of people, definitely by Russia. They probably thought, okay, maybe West would limit to some kind of sanctions and maybe some assistance, but not too much. But this massive assistance that Ukraine is getting in the recent year, it's really much more than Putin probably anticipated. So that's another thing. He is basically now acknowledging this and saying, look, it's entire NATO against us. Yeah, what do you think? Of course it is, because everyone is afraid and everyone is outraged by what you're doing, but also afraid of what you might do next if you prevail in Ukraine. So of course they have to fight back by helping Ukraine. The sanctions, unfortunately, are not working that well, but that's another story. But they're kind of working maybe, but not as well as we hoped. So I think there've been a number of reasons why people had predictions, and the fate of Afghanistan I mentioned maybe was another case in point. People thought, well, that's just another country. It's going to be a failed country. In Ukraine, we were critical of our government always. We were saying some people are incompetent who are in power, some people are corrupt. And everyone else outside of Ukraine heard that too. And they probably thought, okay, this kind of country is going to unravel if Russians strike with all their force. That's the logic. And on the contrary, corruption is still there, unfortunately, but not to the extent that completely would really prevent Ukrainians from being able to fight back. And that's the case. And actually, government is working better since February 24th than before, I think, in Ukraine. And Zelensky has been a man for the moment in many respects. His actually ratings were in upper 20s before the war. He was very popular. That was maybe one of the reasons a lot of people around the world and in Russia thought that, well, people are not going to fight for him, but we're not fighting for Zelensky, we're fighting for our own land. So, but since the start of the war, of course, he's been really successful public communicator and lobbyist for Ukraine, and basically his skills of a professional actor, I guess they were handy now, because when he talks to other audiences, so it kind of shows. So yeah, I guess there was a whole list of issues why people underestimated Ukraine, overestimated Russia's power, but the ultimate, estimate of why that happened will probably still ahead of us.
So in many ways, I think that Russia's relatively poor performance so far in this war has some of its weaknesses economically, militarily, politically.
Yes.
So how do you think, reflecting on this past year, how is the international community's evaluations of Russia's capabilities as a great power, how has it changed? And how might this impact Russia's future geopolitical security and position?
Right. Well, first of all, I kind of alluded to that a little bit in my talk that, yes, of course, Russia's been weakened. Well, that's for sure. I mean, one might say, even if you imagine for a moment they prevail in this war, they're still weakened, by this fierce opposition and resistance of Ukrainians. If they don't prevail in this war, I hope they wouldn't. And I think there is a signs still to say that are telling us that they're not going to prevail in the way they hoped. That's for sure. Then they'll be really weakened. And a lot of people are going to see that there are limits to Russian power. They're limited, military, otherwise. The economy is going to be crippled by sanctions. If they stay in power, I think they should stay. Even though there's some kind of armistice or a ceasefire in this war, or some kind of pause in this war, or maybe subsiding of the level of fighting to some kind of low intensity level, the sanctions should stay. And the Russian economy would be kind of crippled. For instance, last couple of months, they're now selling much less of oil, probably partially because to this oil cap that's been introduced on other countries buying Russian oil. Now, Russians are boasting that they don't need European market anymore. They can sell their oil and gas to Asian markets, for instance, and other markets. But that's not true, of course. It's just boasting, because European market is extremely important for Russian economy. If they lose it, and it seems they're going forward towards losing it, at some point of time, it's going to be a major blow against Russian economy going forward. So I think there will be some reckoning within Russia eventually. So at one point of time, if Putin is out of power one day, I mean, hopefully he's not immortal, there'll be people asking questions like how we got there, why we did what we did. Apparently a lot of people in Russia already, I mean, they kind of with Putin in this war, but at the same time, they understand it was his idea, his war. So I think if he's out of the picture, there will be reasons to believe that the war will unravel. There will be a lot of power struggle in Kremlin. There will be a lot of people saying, okay, we've done enough. We can prevent this war. I think if Putin leaves somehow, sooner the better, that would be really detrimental for their capacity to continue fighting this war in this systemic manner.
So one of the primary justifications that Russian President Vladimir Putin has offered for this war is that Russia is invading Ukraine in response to NATO expansion and Ukraine's deepening relationships with the West. This is also an argument that we have heard from some scholars and individuals in the West as well, that Ukraine is and NATO is an existential threat to Russia's national security. What are your thoughts on this argument that the invasion was a defensive move on Russia's part?
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, let's see. It's a clearly imperialistic war on their behalf. I mean, they're trying to subjugate Ukraine, and Ukraine has always been very important to them historically for centuries. Even many years ago, someone they strongly disliked, now late President Carter's advisor on national security, Viktor Brzezinski, said that without Ukraine under Russian control, Russia actually has a chance to become a normal, civilized, democratic country. But with Ukraine subjugated by Russia, Russia is doomed to be an empire, undemocratic country, not part of the civilized world. And that still stands. That's why they really need to control Ukraine, and that's part of their thinking of great powerness, or maybe being a new empire, or being respected, being feared, and something like that. So that's why they did it. I mean, Ukraine was not a threat to Russia. Ukraine within NATO wouldn't be a threat to Russia unless it's a threat to that model I've just described to you. When Russia says, okay, it's all ours. It's our historical lands. It's our sphere of privileged interests. It's our sphere of interest, and we can actually expand. We can expand. We can remember, the parallel often been drawn for a reason now is Nazi Germany. And the Nazi Germany started by saying, okay, let's maybe focus on returning some of those lands we've lost after the First World War. But that was only a first step. That was a program minimum, so to speak, return some of those lands, but then, okay, they thought, okay, maybe we should go further. And eventually there was this idea of creating the German Reich, of course, from Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And that's what is happening with Putin, because he says, okay, Ukraine now, then Belarus, and maybe Baltics, then maybe South Caucasus, and then who knows? I mean, historically, for half a century, second half of 20th century, entire Eastern Europe was under Moscow control. So why not to try and do something there? So I guess that's his logic. In terms of NATO countries, other countries joining NATO, that's exactly why they joined. They were afraid of Russia, but for the moment, for a lot of time, for a long period of time, NATO was not planning to do anything against Russia. They were not planning any exercises. There were no exercises fighting against Russia. Only when Russia started aggression against Ukraine, actually NATO strategic planning, it was reflected that, okay, we should probably reflect on that. Russia is now a threat, so we can prepare better for fighting the war against Russia. And now, of course, since last year, of course, it's also reflected in their thinking, including the strategic concept, which came out last year. But no, the community of democratic nations that is NATO was not planning on attacking Russia, was only providing assistance to the countries, and not because someone made a decision in Brussels or Washington, but because those countries worked diligently for years to meet criteria to join NATO and EU, to help them to be protected better against the resurgent Russian threat. They've been knowing better always that they will be coming when Russia becomes a threat again. Historically, it's been the case. The Russian behavior, Russian nature, Russian character hasn't changed drastically too much, unfortunately. So therefore, people in the region were really understanding really clearly well what kind of threat they are up against. And that's why they joined the alliance. But there was no danger to Russia unless Russia wanted to conquer those lands.
So you characterize the Kremlin's mindset and policies as imperialist. And indeed, as you mentioned in your talk, President Putin has on a number of occasions referred to Russia and Ukraine as one nation, as one people. Right. So how has this imperialist or expansionist, we might call it, mindset impacted Russia's relationship with the rest of Eurasia, Russia's so-called sphere of influence? I know you spoke about this a bit in your talk. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Right. Well, first of all, it's imperialist war. You have all the signs of imperialist war. You have this culture of superiority of Russians, and everyone is like little brothers around us. We just have to enlighten them. We should bring them the liberation, the freedom, or something like that. That's clearly the imperialistic message that we saw with typical classical Western imperialistic powers in previous centuries. So the fact that the Russian colonies, so to speak, are next door to Russia, unlike, for instance, colonies for these great Western European empires who are, say, in Asia or in Africa, it doesn't take away the fact that they are colonies and they were colonized, and there were people put in power always in those places who were making sure that they have been reliable and loyal to the Russian domination. For Ukraine, for instance, a big portion of Ukraine first became under Russian control in the second half of 17th century. So prior to that happening, Russia wasn't even called Russia. They were referring to themselves as Moscow state. It was run by Tsar, but after Ukraine was incorporated, eastern part of Ukraine was incorporated, they immediately changed their name into Russia, and they became calling themselves an empire. The role model for Mr. Putin, Peter the Great, Peter the First, he was basically, kind of changed his status in the early 18th century to an emperor of Russia. So yeah, this was an imperialistic war, and a lot of people then therefore don't want for Russia to dominate, frankly. And you see it here and there. For instance, Central Asia, they've seen enough from Russian chauvinism. And actually the people from Central Asia who happen to live in Russia, they are constantly being met with derogatory behavior, racism, and being called words and so on. The Kazakhstan, the big country, sitting on very carefully watching the situation. They actually allowed a lot of Russian refugees, so to speak, people help, taking refuge from Russian mobilization, come into Kazakhstan. There are some pro-Russian sentiments. There are some people in Russia who said that some portions of Kazakhstan are actually our historical lands. So maybe they're next when we're done with Ukraine. So of course they're hearing this. And everyone is terrified, but at the same time, everyone is thinking that, okay, we should probably bet on Ukraine withstanding this pressure. That's why we'd probably be able to keep our sovereignty. And I talked about Belarus, for instance, or small country of Moldova. Without Ukrainian defense, Russian troops rolling through the south of Ukraine along the Black Sea coast in the first weeks of the war. If Ukrainians haven't stopped them near Mykolaiv, those troops would come to my hometown of Odesa. They would then come to Moldova. They would take Moldova under their control. They might have triggered actually forceful reaction by Romania, which is a strong partner for Moldova, obviously, and Romania, of course, a member of NATO. So that would really be getting out of control, out of hand much sooner. But of course, what happened has happened. Ukrainians actually stopped Russian troops, and they met their so-called culminating moment. They couldn't advance anymore anywhere in the south. So yeah, I think a lot of people now around the post-Soviet space are looking at Ukraine and hoping that Ukraine prevails. That includes, paradoxically, country of Armenia, for instance, where they had massive demonstrations on the first anniversary of this war in support of Ukraine, and they burned this figure of Putin or something, and that's a country which has been really pro-Russian and depending on Russian support in their struggle against Azerbaijan, of course. But recently, Russia, for various reasons, kind of abandoned Armenia, and that really backfired with Armenians. And now they think, okay, maybe we should choose something else, maybe European integration, maybe NATO, maybe working with countries like Ukraine instead. So there have been a lot of changes already in post-Soviet Eurasian space, and a lot of people are really terrified with what might happen if Russia wins.
So related to that, as you mentioned, countries that were also part of the former Soviet space are really looking toward Ukraine about their own future and changing in some ways their orientation. So what should then the international community be doing, in addition to what they already have done, to help Ukraine and to also help, solidify the future of these other?
Right. Well, I mean, of course, just double down what you're doing right now. Send more weapons, more financial assistance to Ukraine. It's a big war. It's not okay to let Ukraine lose. It's not just about Ukraine, as I just explained. And I think people understand that more and more. In Europe, it's not necessarily Cold War times kind of thinking. People will still probably believe it's not going to be a systemic Cold War like it was in the second half of 20th century. They probably believe that if war over, you can kind of go back to business as usual, maybe with Russia, maybe to some extent. Maybe just keep a dialogue and the window open to the dialogue with Russia or something like that. But still, people kind of understand that's a major wake-up call. So I think just double down on supporting Ukraine, but also supporting us around the globe. I mean, helping other democracies around the globe. Paying attention to what happens now in Moldova, paying attention to what happens in Belarus, paying attention to what happens in Georgia, in South Caucasus, and many other places. And also, by the way, continue what US is doing vis-a-vis China, and this competition that you see emerging, of course, between China and US. I actually don't believe that the choice for the United States is either Russia or China. I do think that, first of all, US is still powerful enough to deal with both of those problems and challenges at the same time. But second of all, there is a connection. By kind of fighting Russia, you're also kind of undermining China, because Russia is their major ally. If you deny Russia victory in Ukraine, you're kind of doing serious blow against the major Chinese ally, which is Russia. So I think those two issues are kind of connected. And when someone hears someone saying, "Oh no, we should focus on China," and we're focusing too much on Russia, I don't think it makes any sense.
No, absolutely. I think that, because this is a global conflict, even though it may seem, to be focused on one country, we do have to consider what are the broader global positioning that matters here. So we're getting close to time, but I have received a number of questions about people asking, what resources would you suggest for keeping up to date on the conflict? So where are you getting your sources? What are you using? What are the news that people in Ukraine are using? Where would you suggest go?
Yeah, I'll quickly then say that, well, you know what? I think that American journalists actually doing a great job in illuminating this war, writing about it, bringing information about it to the American public. So just keep reading American sources. I mean, the trusted outlets, obviously. There are many of them who now have finally offices in Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, including Washington Post, New York Times, NPR. They're doing a great job. Other publications too. They have people on the ground. They have people in the Ukrainian trenches, and I follow a lot of those, and I think, well, it's a really impressive job right now. So I would say just those sources that I mentioned and others are quite kind of doing a good job. I had another interview today, and also from a journalist here in the US, and she said, like, so how would you evaluate how our journalists are covering the war? And I said, actually, it's pretty good, great, it's quite great now.
And is there anything we talked about what the international community can be doing? But people are wondering, like, what can they personally also be doing to support you? Do you have any suggestions?
Sure. I mean, first of all, if you're hosting some refugees from Ukraine, you're already helping. Other things, if you're supporting this idea of helping Ukraine, you're helping. If you're doing fundraising, helping Ukrainian, I mean, it's up to you. You can help Ukrainian military. If you don't want to help military, you can help Ukrainian hospitals, Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian internally displaced persons, Ukrainian children, things like that. You can help restore Ukrainian power energy infrastructure, for instance, being downed by Russian missiles. So there are so many ways to choose what you can do, but primarily, above all, still pay attention. The war is ongoing. It's a war which is not only about the future of my country, my people, but it's really about the future of the entire world. I think it has meaning for all of us, regardless of where we live. And I think the primary kind of help that we expect is not forgetting about the war and pay attention to what's going on there.
I think that's probably a fantastic place to end. I absolutely agree. That one of the most important things for us to do is to keep everyone's eyes on Ukraine, to pay attention to what is happening in the country. And that is a great way to provide support. So yes. On that, thank you for coming and educating us and helping us to better understand what is going on and where we might see this conflict go in the future.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your invitation and your great moderation. And thank everyone who listened to me. I really appreciate your attention.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who attended today. We appreciate you. And thank you, Dr. Dubovyk, for coming.
All right. Bye-bye, Oklahoma. Yeah, stay well, Sooners. Bye-bye.